The Senate will come to order. Senator Westland.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. I impose a call of the Senate.
The Senate is now under call. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that further proceedings under the roll call be dispensed with and that the Sergeant-at-Arms be instructed to bring in the absent members.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Members, if you will kindly stand. As you know, it's the Senate tradition for us to start off our day in prayer, which is followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Today's chaplain is Reverend Jake Hawk. He's from serving the United Methodist Church in Gray Eagle and Sauk Center, Minnesota. Another gentle reminder following the prayer, please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's bow our heads. O Lord, our Redeemer, abide with our senators through the passing hours of another day. Strengthen them to stand firm for those good and eternal values that keep our state strong. Lord, give them the courage to do the right thing when others are doing wrong. Remind them that you are the pilot of their lives who can guide them to a desired destination. Let discretion preserve them, understanding keep them, and faith fortify them. Lead them not into temptation, but deliver them from the forces of evil. Save them from pride that mistakes their abilities for possessions, and keep them humble enough to see their need of you. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
Members, the Secretary will take the roll.
Abler, Anderson, Barr, Bolden, Carlson, Champion, Coleman, Cwodzinski, Dames, Dibble, Dornick, Draheim, Drazkowski, Duckworth, Diedzik, Eichhorn, Farnsworth, Fateh, Frentz, Green, Grunhagen, Gustafson, Hoschild, Herr, Hoffman, Housley, Howe, Jasinski, Johnson, Klein, Coran, Kroon, Kunish, Kupek, Lang, Latz, Liskey, Limmer, Lucero, Mann, Marty, Matthews, May Quaid, McEwen, Miller, Mitchell, Mohammed, Morrison, Murphy, Nelson, Umuver-Baton, Pappas, Pa, Port, Pratt, Putnam, Rarick, Rasmussen, Rest, Seeberger, Utke, Weber, Wiesenberg, Westland, Westrom, Wickland, Zhang.
Members, a quorum is present. The following members intend to vote from a remote location under Rule 40.7. Senator Diedzik. Members, if you'd like to follow along, I'm looking at Senate agenda dated today, Monday, May 13th. We will begin with the third order of business, messages from the House. The Secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate file as amended by the House, in which amendments the concurrence of the Senate is respectfully requested. Senate file number 4699, a bill for an act relating to state government. Senate file number 4699 is herewith returned to the Senate. Signed, Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Wickland for a motion.
Thank you. I move that the Senate do not concur in the amendments by the House to Senate File number 4699 and that a conference committee of 3 members be appointed by the Subcommittee on Conference Committees on the part of the Senate to act with a like conference committee appointed on the part of the House.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Members, the Secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce the passage by the House of the following Senate file as amended by the House, in which amendments the concurrence of the Senate is respectfully requested. Senate file number 4942, a bill for an act relating to state government authorizing supplemental agricultural appropriations. Senate file number 4942 is herewith returned to the Senate. Signed, Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator French for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Senate do not concur in the amendments by the House to Senate file number 4942 and that a conference committee of 5 members be appointed by the Subcommittee on Conference Committees on the part of the Senate to act with a like conference committee appointed on the part of the House.
Member Senator Friends moves that the Senate do not concur in the amendments by the House to Senate file number 4942 and that a conference committee of 5 members be appointed by the Subcommittee on Conference Committees on the part of the Senate to act with the light conference committee appointed on the part of the House. On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Members, we will now proceed to the fifth order of business, which is reports of committees. There are committee reports to read at the desk. The secretary will read the reports.
Senator Marty from the Committee on Finance, to which was re-referred Senate File Number 5430, a bill for an act relating to employees modifying paid leave provisions. Reports the same back with a recommendation that the bill be amended as follows, and when so amended, the bill do pass.
Senator Murphy for a motion to adopt the committee reports.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the committee reports printed in the agenda and read by the secretary be adopted.
Senator Murphy, they have one more. The secretary will read the report.
And Senator Marty from the Committee on Finance, to which was re-referred Senate File Number 4780, a bill for an act relating to labor, regulating transportation network companies. Reports the same back with a recommendation that the bill be amended as follows, and when so amended, the bill do pass.
Now, Senator Murphy.
Mr. President, I move the committee reports printed in the agenda and read by the secretary be adopted.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Members, we will now proceed to the sixth order of business, which is second reading of Senate bills. The secretary will read the Senate file numbers.
Senate File Numbers 5430 and 4780.
The Senate files have been given their second reading. Members, we'll go to the seventh order of business, which is second reading of House files. The secretary will read the House file numbers.
House File Numbers 3872, 4738, 5216, 5246, and 5299.
The House files have been given their second reading. We're at the eighth order of business, members, introduction and first reading of Senate bills. The bills listed on today's introduction calendar are given their first reading and referred as indicated. We're on the ninth order of business.
Mr. President.
Motions and resolutions. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to divide the author's motions listed on the agenda.
And Senator Rasmussen, how would you like to divide it? There are two, so which one would you like to do first?
Senator McEwen's motion can go first, followed by Senator Dietzig's.
All in favor of that motion? Senator Klein.
Mr. President, I request a roll call on the second part of the division.
Okay, so the Senator McEwen, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. We are now on Senator Dietzig motion. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this motion today. So in the motion, we are changing the chief authorship for Senate File 5354, which, as some members may know, is the bill related to historic horse racing. And this bill would clarify that the racetracks in Minnesota cannot offer historic horse racing at the racetracks. And, Mr. President, the reason I rise to talk about this motion today is I have some concerns. The companion bill in the House on Friday in the other body was amended to include full legalization of sports betting. And that bill left the House Ways and Means Committee as sitting on the general register of the other body. And here with this motion, we would be having the chief author of one of the sports betting packages offered in this body now become the chief author of the historic horse racing bill. And so, Mr. President, I was wondering if Senator Klein would yield for a question.
Senator Klein, will you yield? He will yield for a question. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Klein. Senator Klein, is this bill a vehicle bill for legalizing sports betting?
Senator Klein to the question.
Mr. President, Senator Rasmussen, first and foremost, the HHR prohibition is an item of intense and high priority to the Senate DFL caucus and is a must-do for this session in our remaining 6 days. Senator Dietzig is impaired and not available to come to the floor, and I think it's important that we have a chief author who can carry this bill across the floor in the final 6 days. To your question, I am in active discussions not only with my caucus and the House, but also with your caucus about potentially using the HHR bill as a vehicle, as they have done in the House for sports wagering provisions, but that is something that would be before the body.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Klein continue to yield?
Senator Klein, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Klein. This bill, when the sports betting was added on in the other body, went to their equivalent of the Senate Finance Committee because it deals with tens of millions of dollars in both taxes and spending, and over time would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. And so, Mr. President, my question for Senator Klein is, Senator Klein, do you think this bill should go to the Senate Finance Committee if it's going to include sports betting provisions?
Senator Klein.
Mr. President, Senator Rasmussen, I'm going to leave those decisions up to our leadership. It's really important that we get HHR prohibition passed this session.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And another concern I have with this is that if we simply were to take this bill and schedule it here on the floor and pass it out and send it to a conference committee, that bill could come back with sports betting included in it. And that would prevent this body, the Senate, from having any real debate on sports betting and the many important public policy choices that are made as a part of that bill, whether it's the licensing structure, regulatory structure, how we deal with problem gambling that will result from this bill. And so, Mr. President, would Senator Klein yield for another question?
Senator Klein, will you yield for another question? He will yield. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Klein. I appreciate the dialogue on this. Senator Klein, are you willing to commit to the Senate here today that we just won't have a simple HHR bill go off the floor and then have it come back as a conference committee report that fully legalizes sports betting without having to be able to debate that issue thoroughly and amend it here on the Senate floor?
Senator Klein.
Mr. President, the question before the body is on the division of the motion, and should we adopt committee reports. I'm going to decline to answer Senator Rasmussen's question at this time, but I'd be glad to talk to him offline.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the conversation on this, and my concerns continue, and I just think it's important, if the Senate is going to be passing sports betting this session, that we have a full, robust debate here on the Senate floor. But I appreciate the conversation and dialogue today, Mr. President. Thank you.
Roll call has been requested. Roll call granted. Senator Uckey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a procedural question. We're debating and going to have a vote on changing the author of this bill, but when I look it up on my screen here and on the computer and look at it, it's already been done. Wouldn't it need this vote to actually be in effect?
Senator Uckey, to your question, what is the practice is that if there's a motion that's offered, it's adjusted within the system, and if there's any corrections that need to be made, they certainly will go back and make those corrections. So it's not done until this procedure is finished. In the case that something is printed in the agenda, the system will show that, but then it will make the modification. Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, looking at, Mr. President, what Senator Uckey pointed out, it sounds like it's done. D-O-N-E, done. Could you outline for us what the process is for the authorship in this situation to be changed? How does the majority communicate that to staff to do that? Can you outline that for us, Mr. President?
Senator Cwodzinski, thank you for the question. What happens is that if there is a motion that is put forward and is printed in the agenda, it has been the practice of the front desk staff, which I've confirmed, that they highlighted as if it's done just for the purpose of that moment because they get thousands and thousands sometimes of these requests. Once the motion is official on the floor, if it goes through, then it stays just that way. If If for some reason this motion does not pass, then the front desk staff will update the system. And just so that there is clarity and so that there's no confusion, it's being removed as we speak, just so that there's no worries. But that's what's usually done. There's been a roll call requested and a roll call granted. The secretary would take the roll. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I share the same concerns that Senator Rasmussen expressed. The idea that we would pass a clean historical horse racing bill off of this floor and have it come back with a full sports betting bill in a conference committee report without any opportunity for this body to thoroughly vet it and provide amendments would be extraordinarily disappointing to me. Extraordinary. This is a very important issue. The people of Minnesota expect this body to be very much involved in it and to short circuit the process, and I did not hear a denial from Senator Klein that that's the plan. Would be very disappointing to me, Mr. President.
Members, just so that I'm clear, and then I'll recognize the others that have asked to speak. There's one more speaker before you, Senator Cwodzinski. Just so that folks are clear that what is before the body is not the underlining bill. There's no motion on the table in order to deal with the bill in particular and or pass it off of this floor. Just so that we're clear what is before the body, because we're hearing a lot of comments about what would be disappointing. Get it, but that's not the issue that's before the body. What is before the body, if you look in our Senate agenda, is just removing one name to be stricken as chief authors, and then for that to be replaced with another. As you know, once it goes through that process, there still would have to be a bill that has to come to this table. Senator McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I'm going to recommend a green vote on this, though I do share the concerns that were articulated by the good senator from Fergus Falls about the underlying bill and the way that the other bill is traveling through the other body. I deeply share those concerns, and I'm in alignment, but I do think we should vote green on this particular motion, and I'm going to recommend that vote.
Senator Cwodzinski.
I rise for another point of information, Mr. President. Mr. President, you had mentioned that it is normal procedure to make the changes to the authorship prior to getting here, and only if the motion doesn't pass, going back and changing it. So we haven't had the vote yet, Mr. President, so why are we changing it now?
Because we have a motion before us, and because it doesn't look like it's going to be routine anything, that is why they are making that change right now, just to make sure that there's no problems and no challenges, because it is just that usually routine motion is never, usually we don't have this amount of energy generated on a simple routine motion. Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we may want to re-examine our procedures, Mr. President. It just seems to me that if indeed the process is to make the change if it didn't pass, we should wait till it didn't pass before we make the change, if indeed that is the case. Thank you, Mr. President.
And so just for the body's purpose, right now it doesn't show any information at all or any change. But your point is well taken. We will always reassess ourselves because we believe that there's room for improvement. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Klein yield for a question?
Senator Klein, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Klein, I'm a supporter of sports betting, but I am concerned about the process. Will you commit to the body that you'll request a hearing in finance?
Senator Klein, to the question.
Point of order, Mr. President.
For what purpose do you rise?
Mr. President, under Mason's 114.5, a question as to what course a member proposes to follow is not in order.
Members, give me 1 second. You said Mason's 114.5?
Point 5, correct. The last sentence, a question as to what course a member proposes to follow is not in order.
Please review the section of Mason's that have been articulated, and I will read it for you, and then we can go forward. A question should not be permitted that reflects upon the character or conduct of any member or upon the executive or other official. The aspect of the rule that seems to pertain to this matter, a question as to what course a member proposes to follow is not in order. I'm not going to rule on it. I'm just going to tell you that that's what it is, and hopefully that would be gentle enough in order for us to move on. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Murphy yield for a question?
Senator Murphy, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Murphy, would you be opposed to moving Senate File 5354 to the Finance Committee as a member of the Finance Committee if it were to come back with expanded language?
Senator Murphy, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Pratt, and I've got members over here suggesting it is the same point of order that you've just gently reminded us about. I'm going to continue my focus on getting the work of Minnesota done in this last week of this legislative session.
Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Like I said, I am a proponent of sports betting, but I'm very concerned with the answers that I'm getting from the majority leader and from the proposed chief author of the bill. I think there ought to be some sort of commitment to the body that if this comes back with a significant fiscal note and fiscal cost to the state, that it be re-referred back to finance and considered. I agree with Senator Murphy. We're here to get the business done of Minnesotans, and we are absolutely discussing this bill because Senator Klein believes that this is an important issue that will affect the lives of Minnesotans, and I think we ought to have that discussion and that commitment to follow the process and to consider all the costs and not just to concur. So, Mr. President, thank you.
Members, just a gentle reminder that we are only on the motion that is before us, which is Senator Disick moves that her name be stricken as chief author. We're not debating the underlining bill. Senator Klein.
Mr. President, you took the words out of my mouth. The question before us today is, should the chief author of the bill in question be changed from Disick to Klein? The HHR prohibition bill itself will have its day on the floor, at which point these comments and questions would be in order.
The Secretary will take the roll on the motion. There's been a roll call requested, roll call granted. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Disick votes aye.
Senator Disick votes aye. Members, please vote. All members voting who has a desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 55 ayes and 11 noes, the motion is adopted. Senator Murphy on the floor motion.
Mr. President.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have a motion pursuant to Mason's Chapter 522. I move the Senate challenge the vote cast by Senator Nicole Mitchell on May 9th to uphold the ruling of the President as recorded on page 16,645 of the Senate Journal. This vote was in conflict, or this was a conflict of interest in violation of Senate Rule 56.4.
Senator Pratt, I want to make sure that there's no one else to speak to this motion before we go forward. Senator Pratt, your motion is available in writing. We're going to distribute that writing, and then I'll come back to you. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd ask that the pages pass out that motion. Mr. President?
Hold on a moment, Senator Pratt. We want to make sure that everyone has it in front of them, and then we will proceed.
Mr. President, I'd like to impose a call of the Senate.
The Senate is now under call. And Senator Pratt, for clarity, are you doing the call of Senate just for the balance of your motion, or what?
Just for the balance of the motion, Mr. President.
Thank you for that clarity. In the back, once you get a copy of the written Pratt motion, please let me know so we can proceed. Senator French, were you standing just to say you got it, or you want to speak? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Mr. President, I did receive a copy, and I also wanted to be put in the line to speak.
Thank you.
Mr. President?
Senator Pratt, to your motion, and just so that we're clear, members, the written motion says pursuant to Mason's Chapter 522. It is not a chapter, it is sections, just so you know. And we're still under call, and I need a motion.
Thank
Senator
you,
Pratt.
Mr. President. I move further proceedings under the roll call be dispensed with, and the Sergeant at Arms be instructed to bring in the absent members.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Okay, Senator Pratt, to your underlining motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, this goes to the appeal of the President when the presiding officer ruled against a motion that we made around specifically to Senator Mitchell. We had asked if Senator Mitchell had excused herself. Due to that conflict of interest, we were told by you that she was not. That was not her request. And then she voted on the motion to appeal. That directly affected her. I believe that's in violation of Senate File 56.4 and Mason's 522.
Thank you, Senator Pratt. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Pratt. Members, I would urge you to vote no on the Pratt motion. First of all, members, we need to get our work done. That's what the people want us to do in the last week. But to the motion itself, Mr. President, the motion by Senator Pratt was to excuse Senator Mitchell. That motion failed, and she was compelled to return and vote. Members, I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pursuant to Rule 41.2, I move to be excused from voting on all questions pertaining to the Pratt motion, and I request a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. And members, that's a non-debatable motion, so you all can sit until we vote. A roll call was requested and roll call granted. The secretary would take the roll on the Mitchell motion. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 55 ayes and 11 noes, the motion prevails. Senator Klein.
Mr. President, on the Prada motion, I request a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, and I want to thank Senator Frentz for bringing up the procedures from last Thursday. Mr. President, you'll recall that we specifically asked if Senator Mitchell had excused herself due to a conflict of interest. Senator Mitchell had put up her vote as part of the call of the Senate, indicating she had not been accused. She, according to you, her request to be excused was not due to a conflict of interest. And Senator Mitchell was in the chamber at the time that we voted. And so, Mr. President, had Senator Mitchell or you indicated that the excusal was due to a conflict of interest, we wouldn't be here. But Senator Mitchell did vote. She did not ask to be excused as she did today due to a conflict of interest, and therefore her vote was in violation of Section 56.4 and Mason's 522.
Any other questions before we take the roll? Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in favor of this motion because there clearly was a conflict of interest. There was a conflict of interest. But I'm intrigued by the comments of Senator Frentz in his remarks when he said the people of Minnesota want us to get our business done. That is 100% correct. But do you know what the people of Minnesota want more, Mr. President? Is the functions of this body, the decisions of this body, the choices of individual members to be ethical, to be upstanding. And that's why we have this motion before us. And so we don't want to just plow through because it's the last week of session. We want to be deliberative. We want to be cognizant of decisions that are being made to uphold the trust of voters across Minnesota. And again, not just ram legislation through, but to do so in an orderly fashion that upholds the values of Minnesota, which again is ethical and trust. Thank you, Mr. President.
The secretary will take the roll on the Pratt amendment. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Lucero. Mr. President, I think Senator Lucero brought up a very important point. According to Mason's 522, members should be barred from voting on proposals of direct personal interest only in clear cases and when the proposal is particularly personal, which this was. The motion was to find Senator Mitchell had probable cause coming out of the Ethics Committee. I think many of us were disappointed in the outcome of the Ethics Committee. It seemed to be a highly partisan, highly politically charged hearing that should have allowed the investigation to go forward. And it also says, Mr. President, that the rule is not self-enforcing, and unless the vote is challenged, members may vote as they choose. So under Mason's, this challenge is the only way that we have at this point in time to challenge the vote that Senator Mitchell did, in fact, cast a vote in conflict of interest. And members, I think it's exceedingly clear that that's what happened. We need to stand up for the rules of the Senate. We need to stand up for our custom and usage. We need to stand up for the legislative process. And I can't think of why, with this particular remedy, as outlined in Mason, since this is, we've never had a member vote in conflict of interest and like this in probably a century. And so we really don't have defined rules, but members, I can't imagine anyone saying that that vote by Senator Mitchell on a ruling that you made directly impacting her could not be a conflict of interest. And so, Mr. President, let's put the partisanship aside and let's understand that this is, in fact, the proper motion and the proper remedy for what occurred on Thursday.
The secretary will take the roll on the Pratt amendment. Motion, I'm sorry, the Pratt motion. Please accept my apologies. The Pratt motion. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes no.
Senator Dietzig votes no. Members, again, I'm going to remind you to stay near the floor. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 33 ayes and 33 nays, the Pratt motion is not adopted. Senator Murphy for a motion.
Mr. President, I move that House File 4984 be taken from the table and given a second reading.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The secretary will give the House file a second reading.
House File number 4984.
Now, Senator Murphy for that motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that House File 4984 be laid on the table.
All in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate file number 3567 be now adopted and the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee.
Senator Cwodzinski moves that the foregoing recommendation and conference committee report on Senate file number 3567 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee. Senator Cwodzinski, please explain the differences and what's going on in the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have before you, members, the Education Conference Committee report policy approved by the three senators, myself, Senator McEwen, and Senator Abler. There's a lot going on in this bill. A lot of it's dealing with experimentation, if you will, and local control, and coming up with some great ideas to make our schools and our students and our teachers and administrators even better than they already are. One of them is a model cell phone policy. One is a 4-day school week. One is ableism and disability justice. A lot of the parts of this bill were compromises that were negotiated and worked on throughout the session, and in particular during conference committee. They are too many to name, but they're there. I also want to thank my members on the other side of the aisle, Senator Coleman, Senator Abler, Senator Lang, for their contributions to the bill. I'd like to thank Senator Mann and Senator Seeberger and Kunish and Bolden and Gustafson for their contributions to this bill. I think you guys know me well enough after 8 years to know that I truly believe with every fiber in my body that the Article 13 of the Minnesota State Constitution, which states a Republican form of government dependent upon the intelligence of the people, it is the duty of the legislature to create a general and uniform system of schools. I also want to remind members what's outside the chamber, engraved in stone, are the words right outside the door. Next to importance to freedom and justice is popular education, without which neither justice nor freedom can be permanently maintained. That's the work that guides me throughout my time here, especially on Education Policy Committee. I think what I tried to do this year, along with my colleagues that signed on to the bill, is to give our students a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. As in recent years, as so many of you know, the number of people participating in civic organizations has plummeted. People don't belong to Rotary anymore, VFWs, or Optimist clubs, or the League of Women Voters. And I think it behooves us to try to build that feeling of civic virtue and civic engagement in our youth so that they can have the tools necessary so that they will rebuild and revitalize that sense of civic engagement I believe we once had as a nation. And the last two comments I want to make, I just want to say, I think if anything, in the last couple years in a pre-COVID educational world, we've started getting back to the holistic child. And not just academic learning, but emotional and social and physical and spiritual learning that students need to have in order to reach their self-actualization, their full sense of being. I want to remind members of a German phrase called learn, frei, bite. I'm sure I'm butchering it. Learn, frei, bite. It means freedom to learn. That our students should have freedom to learn. And that's what I hope this bill does. So I ask for your support of the conference committee report. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on the conference on adoption of the conference committee report? Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cwodzinski, for the provision of mine that ended up in this bill. It is incredibly heartbreaking to hear that a majority of eating disorders start at such a young age. So anything that we can do, partnering with the high school league to put an end to that, is a good thing in this bill. I think it kind of stops short of there, members. What we heard in the interim and what we've heard all of session is not addressed or fixed in this bill. What I'm hearing from our schools is that they are desperate for more assistance with school safety. When I hear from our teachers that they are terrified to speak out without being fired. When I hear that they have students coming in as young as middle school with weapons and joining gangs, that's a problem for me. And when I try to imagine what mothers and fathers who have no option but to send their children to those schools must go through every day, my heart breaks. We don't address that in this bill. I have superintendents and principals from around the state trying to get into my office, begging for help tackling some of the mandates that were passed last cycle. We don't help them with that. In fact, we give them more in this bill. When I have teachers and superintendents from other districts begging for time on my calendar because their senator won't meet with them, I don't feel confident that people actually know what they're doing and how this will impact their district because they aren't hearing the stories that need to be heard. Now, it's clear who this bill is looking out for, members, and it is not our teachers, and it certainly is not our students. I urge a no vote. We can do better than this. Thank
Senator
you.
Lang.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to thank Senator Cwodzinski for the inclusion of the 4-day school week. And this is something, Mr. President, where I don't normally stand and pontificate about education bills or anything that I'm not super familiar with, but I do have a great relationship with a bunch of the superintendents from my district, and I can tell you that the one thing they asked for right away and the one thing that we're responding to pretty quickly, and thank you, Senator, for doing so, is the 4-day school week. And this, for us in rural Minnesota, actually provides a lot of leeway, a lot of, hopefully, dollar savings for busing. And what it really does, Mr. President, is allows those school districts to make that decision for themselves. Takes it out of the hand of the department, which I know that they've done so and they've said so, but I think that this gentle push from this body and the other body, and hopefully through the governor's office, will help us into the future. So again, thank you for that provision and the addition into the bill, Senator. So thank you.
Senator Gruenhagen.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, if Senator Cwodzinski would yield for a question.
Senator Cwodzinski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Cwodzinski. Senator Gruenhagen.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for yielding. My question is in regard to page 97, the book banning prohibited. You know, we have a lot of parents who are showing up at school board meetings in our state and across the nation objecting to certain curriculum, either explicitly graphic or teaching values that are contrary to the principles our country was founded on. So does this provision, how does that affect parents willing to come to a school board to object to a particular book or curriculum at a public school board meeting?
Senator Cwodzinski.
Yeah, thanks for. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that question, Senator. If you read line 98, 9810, the parents still have the right to curriculum review and seeking an alternative curriculum if they so desire. So your concerns are addressed in the bill.
Senator Grutenhagen.
Oh, thank you for that answer, Senator Cwodzinski. Yeah, I found that, you know, I was a public school board member for 16 years. Of course, we know that. And I spent a lot of time on curriculum while I was at a school board meeting. In fact, I was on the curriculum committee. And one of the things I found is that our public schools in general do a lot of censorship, lies, and deceit as far as their curriculum that's being taught to the children. Now, I'm going to give you several examples, and this is why this particular provision does give me some concern. And I know it's a governor initiative, but I think it could be used against parental input, even with that comfort language that's in there. You know, one of the things I found is that we do a lot of censoring in our public schools of our founding documents. In fact, I had a retired U.S. history teacher, public school, come to my office after I wrote an editorial about multicultural diversity versus the teaching of U.S. history and patriotism. And he had been a public school teacher for over 30 years. He was also my assistant football coach when I played football for Glencoe. And he just said, you know, Glenn, I agree with you. He said, in the 50s, we taught U.S. history and patriotism to our students. Then in the 60s and the 70s, we switched over to social studies, which basically watered down the teaching of U.S. history and patriotism. He said, now we're moving to multiculturalism and diversity, which basically is censoring many of the principles of U.S. history and patriotism that our country is founded on. And today, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've all but completely censored and banned curriculum, both in our libraries and even in our schools, to the teaching of students of what this country was actually founded on. In fact, if you'll remember, I brought a recommendation forward on one of the education bills to teach that we're founded as a God-given rights constitutional republic versus a mob democracy, just encouraging that to be taught to our students. And that was voted down by the people on the other side of the aisle. So, you know, the book banning has been going on for decades, and it's mostly by the liberal left in our public schools, and it's robbing the children of the heritage and the principles that our country is founded on. Another area is in science. I find a lot of censorship, lies, and deceit. You know, there's lots of scientific evidence that points to a creator or God. And I'll just give you two. One is the law of cause and effect. For every effect, there's a greater cause. So you have a computer. Did somebody make the computer? If you'd never seen it before, did somebody make the computer? Or did wind, rain, time, and chance blow the computer into existence? Well, the logical conclusion is someone made the computer. Well, your eyeball is millions of times more complex than that computer, and therefore the law of cause and effect has never been contradicted. You have this building, somebody built it. You have the earth, somebody made it. You have the universe, somebody created it. That is a repeatable and observable scientific fact. and yet we censor that from our students. One other scientific fact that is censored from the students, and it was by Louis Pasteur, the founder of modern medicine. He discovered the law of biogenesis. That means life only begets life. Life does never come from non-life, which is what macroevolution teaches, that life came from non-life. That's a unscientific, religious fanatic belief. Life only begets life, therefore what? You had to have a life giver. And of course, our founding fathers put the word creator, and our country was founded on the Judeo-Christian principles, and yet we censor that information from the students to our own detriment. And now we see the problems we have in the public school. One other area is in reading. You know, when I got elected to the school board, one of the things I brought up was the teaching of intensive systematic phonics at the school board meeting versus the whole language curriculum or basal literature. You would have think I said a cuss word when I mentioned that at the school board meeting, the way people reacted. Well, we finally are moving towards that now, and I appreciate that in the curriculum. But for a long time, we were teaching a technique that was causing reading problems in the students, and we censored the information and facts that could have helped solve that problem. So members, I have a lot of concern about this provision, and really, I think it's going to be used to shut down parental input to a certain degree, regardless of the comfort language. And again, it's been our public educational system that has promoted censorship, lies, and deceit over the last 20 to 30 years. Please vote no.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Cwodzinski yield for a question?
Senator Cwodzinski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Senator Cwodzinski. And I have a concern as well related to the provisions on page 97, the book banning. As I read the verbiage at the top of page 97, beginning in line 2, it says a public library must not ban, remove, or otherwise restrict access to a book or other material based solely on its viewpoint or other messages, ideas, or opinions it conveys. I look down and it defines a public library beginning on line 97.7. So if my understanding is correct, the scope of a public library extends well beyond a public school. So my question, Mr. President, for Senator Cwodzinski, is my understanding correct that the provisions in this bill are not limited to just schools?
Senator Cwodzinski.
That is correct. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Cwodzinski. Would he yield for another question?
Senator Cwodzinski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cwodzinski. So as I flip the page, I am looking at line 98.2 and 98.10, and both of them make a reference to Minnesota Statute 120B.20. And specifically, the verbiage in both of those lines says the policy that no material shall be prohibited based on, and I read that the provision there, must not impair or limit the rights of a parent, guardian, or student adult under section 120B.20. So I looked up that statute, 120B.20, and it's speaking about alternative methods of instruction that would be available to the parent. So the language that's being pointed to here, it says that nothing in the prohibition will require the parent or prohibit the parent from seeking that alternative instruction. So, Mr. President and Senator Cwodzinski, could you please confirm for me, how do these provisions on line 98.2 and 98.10 have any bearing in the context of a non-school school scenario, so it'd be a public library, not in the school.
Senator Cwodzinski.
Well, I might ask you to repeat the question because that was a long question, but I do know that the Minnesota Library Association oversees public libraries and public schools libraries. I don't know if that answers your question, but I may resort to Senator Kunish, thank you, to help me out with that as well, to make sure my answer was accurate. Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Lucero.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Cwodzinski yield for a question?
Senator Cwodzinski will yield. He will yield. Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Cwodzinski, 120B.20 is in reference to parental curriculum review. And it allows for a parent to have an alternative to potential content as part of instruction in a classroom. The provision in the bill, it prohibits restriction from material based on its viewpoint, messages, ideas, and opinions, etc. The provision encompasses, as you already stated, libraries that are outside of the school. So how does the language in 120B.20 have any bearing in the context of a minor with access to content in a public library that's not in a school?
Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. As much as I enjoy your soliloquy, Senator Lucero, could you rephrase specifically the question for me? Thank you.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Cwodzinski yield for a question?
He will yield.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Cwodzinski, you have a provision in here that is going to not allow for the limitation of access. That preventing the limiting of access of content is not just to libraries in schools. It is also to libraries not in schools. Any public library, per the definition in your own bill. I can't look back, so I'm just holding it up so you can see it. You define a public library. In addition to that, you pointed to line 98.10 as comfort language that would allow a parent to still have control over access of material. My question to you is, for the third time, how does line 98.10 have any bearing in the context of a child accessing content that they're not ready for because of the prohibition you're putting in place in a public library that's not in a school?
Senator Cwodzinski to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Lucero, for your patience and trying to reach my brain with your third question now. 120B.20 only applies to school libraries, not public libraries.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's what I wanted to seek clarity on, and I just got the confirmation. So members, Mr. President and members, the language that comes back from conference is going to, and I'll read it again, a public library must not ban, remove, or otherwise restrict access to a book or other material based solely on its viewpoint or the messages, ideas, or opinions it conveys. This is in context well outside schools. And we know that young people, minors, they frequent public libraries. And because the governor and the Democrat majority is putting this provision in place, young people, children, will now have access to content that they are not ready for because the law will prohibit the restriction of access to that content. The comfort language that was attempted to be pointed to on lines 98 .20 and 98.10 do not apply in this scenario. And therefore, Mr. President, if for no other reason, this alone is good enough reason to oppose this bill. And I will add one more thought along these lines. I know not everyone in here subscribes to the pages of truth, but I am among those that do subscribe to the pages of truth. And in Psalm 101, verse 3, Psalm chapter 101, verse 3, it says, "Set no wicked thing before my eyes." In my time in the legislature, I have had a front row seat witnessing members and a party deliberately pushing content front and center so that the eyes of our young people are forced to view it. Content they're not ready for, content that warps their mind. And for those like myself and parents across this state, when they also subscribe to this truth, set no wicked thing before my eyes, they are going out of their way to try to prevent their children from accessing pornographic or otherwise perverse content. And this language that is being pushed by the Democrat governor and the Democrat majority in this body is contrary to that reality, the reality of parents that want to protect the minds of their children, and instead the Democrats are seeking to pollute the minds of our young children. Vote no on this motion. Thank you.
Members, we're going to, if it's okay, then we can adopt the report, and then we'll still go to third reading, and then you'll still be able to speak, if that's okay, Senator Utke. Okay, thank you. Members, Senator Cwodzinski moved that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate file number 3567 be now adopted, and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The motion prevails, and the secretary will give the bill as third, the conference committee report is third reading, and then we can still go to the people who still want to speak.
Senate file number 3567, a bill for an act relating to education, modifying provisions for pre-kindergarten through grade 12 education, including general education, etc.
Third reading now, Senator Utke.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, we have another bill before us with a lot of concerns in it. Talking to our schools back home and around the state, they were just, I mean, that occupied the whole last off session with what took place last year. Now this just adds another layer to it. If we talk to our school administrators and school boards, they just shudder at what gets sent to them. And I just did a quick little search on this bill, 119 pages. Search the word must. That's something that makes the hair on the back of their neck stand up. It's another demand or another mandate. Now, they're not all new. Some of those musts have been there for a long time. But there are a lot of new mandates. The word must has been inserted again a number of times. And members, we've got to do better. They are still choking and struggling over what was sent their way last year. And now we look at an additional list of demands and mandates. But Mr. President, if Senator Cwodzinski would stand for, I have one question for him if he'd yield.
Senator Cwodzinski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Utke.
Thank you. And the one question I have is one of the topics that pops up. It's early on in the bill, page 29, and it's the student journalism section. And I have, just looking at some of the information that we have, talks about how the school boards have this right to supervise and oversee the student journalism. And it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Is that not true, that this is overstepping those bounds in that ruling and telling them that they can't do something that the Supreme Court has already said they have the right to do?
Senator Cwodzinski to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Utke, and can you rephrase the question succinctly, please?
Senator Utke.
I'm pretty sure I have the answer.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah,
Senator
in this, it deals with the student journalism, and this bill is basically telling the schools that they don't have the ultimate right and level of authority to supervise the students and their instructors. And what I'm basing it off is a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that's previously been put in place that gives the schools the authority. Does this language in the current bill not end run or go against the U.S. Supreme Court ruling?
Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Utke, no, it does not. There's clearly, it lays out in subdivision 2 that the freedom of speech is not absolute, as the Supreme Court said, and that there are limitations, that the advisor to the activity shall not use prior restraint, and that we did make an exception on the yearbook because school districts did ask us to try to anything with permanence as opposed to a school newspaper, such as a yearbook, would be exempt from this provision. So thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Utke.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't know that the Supreme Court ruling isn't still in effect, but that's a debate for another day. But anyhow, I'll just stop with that comment and that question, and just there's just no way I could support this and would recommend a red vote. So thank you.
Senator Nelson.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to say a few thank yous for some things I do see in this bill. I do see that a few, and I emphasize a few, of the many, many mandates that are causing our schools to have fiscal challenges, just a few, 3 of them, have been changed to permissive, encouraged, or optional. That's a good move, members. Last year, we have, with the many, many mandates that were passed, some in the education bill, some of the most expensive mandates on our school were passed in the labor bill. Regardless of what bill they were passed in, they are suffocating and making it very difficult for our schools to, number one, not have referendums just to pay for those mandates. So I'm glad to see those 3 softening of some of the many mandates from last year. But I do want to mention one piece that still causes me great concern, and that does have to do, I believe Senator Utke was visiting about that, and that has to do with how we are treating our school newspapers. In other words, what's happening with the bill before us today, our school newspapers must allow students to print anything, including advertisements. Very few restrictions, a few perhaps subjective concepts to be followed. But the fact is, this really puts our schools in a difficult spot, and I can understand why the school principals testified strongly against this provision. Schools currently have the right, as supported by the U.S. Supreme Court, upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, to supervise and oversee these student publications in order to preserve their educational mission and to protect them from liable, or to be liable for the articles that the students have published in the school newspaper. And it's really shocking that this bill removes that ability from our school districts. It does put our schools in a very precarious position. And I cannot understand why we are treating the school newspapers differently than we are the school yearbooks that have that protection for our schools. And so again, I am fearful that if this passes, which it sounds like it's going to today, this provision alone regarding school newspapers and the ability to publish and not have any oversight regarding keeping the educational mission or being protected from defamation, I think that is fearfully going to perhaps be the end of school newspapers. I think that is also a tragedy that we could have avoided had this piece not been kept in the bill. I will be voting no on this bill, thankful for a bit of mandate softening, but lo and behold, there's more mandates in here on top of that. So again, Senator Cwodzinski, some good things here, but I think there are things that are incredibly troubling I will not be supporting.
Senator Abler.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Cwodzinski, thank you for an entertaining conference committee. And we did spend some time. There was a chance to vet some stuff, and the dialogue was good. Representative Ryer was very gracious chair as well. But one thing I didn't do, Senator Cwodzinski, was to move to send this back to conference, and I was actually kind of torn about that. Because it should go back to conference, and I'm not making that motion because we're on adoption now, and so clearly I thought about it and didn't do it. So this is 117 pages of education policy, and a lot of it will make it easier for the Department of Education to mess with schools. That's high praise. Actually, they mess with schools already, and Mr. President, I don't know if you remember, and Senator Cwodzinski, you probably recall, that each and every school district in Minnesota has elections every year or two to actually set leadership in their school districts. And clearly at the central level in particular, they don't have a lot of confidence in their ability to do a job, to educate their students, and maybe even to act like they care. This bill is just another example of the erosion of that. Last year's bill was even worse. I voted for this bill for some reasons I'll explain. I'm going to vote for the bill for some reasons I'll explain. But I'm really frustrated. Mr. President, and to the public, whatever happens, 80% of the kids, the students in our state of grade school age are going to go to a public school, a traditional public school. And whatever you think about that, and unions, and policies, and school boards, and charter schools, 80% are going to go there. And so it's a constitutional duty that they can do well. And I was somewhat amused, I wished you wouldn't have said this, freedom and justice and education and public duty and holistic training. Mr. President, I think most of our parents want their kids to learn something. And I think, you know, if you just look at the way it's going, for all the money that went in last year and even the years before, half the kids in third grade across the state, Mr. President, cannot read or write at grade level. And furthermore, for all the interest in BIPOC and DEI and diversity and reaching out to all groups, a disproportionate share of those who are challenged for whatever reason are in the group that cannot read and do math. And so I want to subscribe to the members of this body and to the governor and to the Department of Education. It's not working. It's not working. And so my district, still the largest in the state, Mr. President, I'm just pleased to represent it. But given all that money and all the fact that they themselves are just a nit above that half of the students who can read and do math at third grade level, are cutting as administrative cuts, reading specialists. And that's part of administration. Like, holy cow. And so in this bill, there is some discussion about the READ Act, and so I'm happy that the state is paying attention to that. I'm challenged that some of the putting that into implementation is actually going to cause ANOCA to lay off some reading specialists so we can implement the READ Act so kids can read. And I think if the people watching at home, they want us to get stuff done, just normal things. Could you make the hospitals work? Could I have a nursing home available? Could I have an ambulance ride if I'm out in the country at the lake, my husband breaks his leg or something? My child has a bee sting and needs epinephrine injectors that we don't happen to have at our cabin. And could the schools actually teach kids to read? And could they teach the kids to do math? It's just, and this bill doesn't do a lot about that. And so when I first met the governor, when we got in here 6 years ago, I said, I'd like to work with you on stuff. You go, yeah, we can do that. And so, and maybe if he'd call me back once in a while, we could work on some of those things, but he's a busy guy. But one of the things he brought forward in this bill that he was really proud of, and how do I know he's proud of it? Because he talks about it all the time, is one of the scourge, Mr. President. Minnesota has been scourged just by, it's almost like a plague, at least from the way that they tell it. The marquee thing in this bill that came out of the governor's office was banning book banning. And big to-do, like he's on national TV and we're gonna stop this. And Mr. President, I've not met one person in Minnesota who thought that was anything to rise above a sea level. Certainly it's not as important as worrying about like reading and math and maybe safety in schools. And there's nothing about safety in schools here, Mr. President. I tried to have an amendment stuck on to have people talk about the new discipline policy that we passed last year, that you can't really kick a child out for very long. A parent wrote me, and their third grader is a daughter at one of the Coon Rapids schools, and there's a second grader who's been harassing her and threatened to bring a knife to poke her in second grade, Mr. President. And so I don't know anything about this second grader, but I know he had to go home for a little bit and he's back the next morning. I suggested, how about if they give a little time so they can come up with a plan to help this little second grade knife fighter to maybe get on track and not go out the back door someday and join a gang and come to tremendous harm. But no, there's nothing here to help that family in Coon Rapids feel relief. And I'm disappointed, but Mr. President, the governor brought forward banning book banning. And so thank goodness. But I want to thank the chairman and the other body for actually making it into status quo. There was a title, if you read it, the subtitle, the heading says something about library access or something, and that was my contribution to this. And the librarians from the counties and the school districts said that was kind of not a very good title because we don't really have a lot of book banning going on. There's not like fires where they burn the witches and the books and all that. We kind of got away from that. And so there is still that little subtitle, and so the governor's going to get his reward. But if you read down very far, it says you can't ban books based upon what they say. Like, okay, like so. But in the rest of the bill, it says you got to have a policy. You know what, Mr. President, after all this big hoo-ha on the governor's number one thing and paying no attention to reading and math and discipline and my little constituent worried about getting knifed at school, you know what it says? The district has to have a policy. Anoka district has a policy, and it's a great policy. You know what's going to change in Anoka from all this big hoo-ha, from misrepresenting the needs of education? Nothing. My county library, you know what's going to change with their policies on books? Nothing. So, Mr. President, I'm going on like this because we are failing. There is no one more committed, Mr. President, to the education of our youth than you, and worried about some of the future of our citizens and our students, what is going to happen. And so we have this bill that does some nice things. I like the READ Act in there. I like the special ed reciprocity. I think the 4-day week, I actually worked on that, Mr. President, 20 years ago, and that's going to go forward. And Mr. President, I do believe freedom and justice rely on education. It's a duty. It's in the Constitution. And it says the parents got to be part of it. So I'm glad we retained that little bit. And so, Mr. President, it's a big deal. And why am I going on a little bit here? The last two bills we've had for education on the finance, last year and this year's, were done like at 4 in the morning when nobody's watching. So, Mr. President, I hope they're watching today. I hope that they let us all know on a bipartisan basis we care about our kids. And could you do something real to keep my classes whole? This bill goes just a nit. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, Senator Abler and others have captured some of what I am seeing and hearing and observing in our state. Members, it wasn't a year ago and we had a $19 billion surplus. $2.2 billion of that, the largest budget area, was spent in the area of K through 12 education. So what happened? We get to this year, Mr. President, our schools are telling us we don't have the money to operate going forward. I've heard that many, many times from schools in my district and from other districts in the state. The money's gone. They don't have the ability to operate with a historic $2.2 billion more than they had the biennium before. Well, the answer probably lies in what we see happening here, Mr. President, at the legislature. The Minnesota legislature, led by Minnesota Democrats, has become a state school board. The statewide school board is telling local school boards, you don't matter anymore. We're going to educate the kids. We're going to make the decisions for your school district. We're still going to require you to go force the property taxes out of the taxpayers to pay for them, but we're going to tell you how it's done. That's what we're seeing happen here, Mr. President. Last year, 65 different state mandates passed by this Democrat-controlled legislature, this Democrat-controlled state school board, dictating to the 332 school districts in Minnesota that this is what you have to do. It was in the bill. It was in House File 2497, fifth engrossment. Matter of fact, there were 65 of these mandates telling school districts, forcing them what they had to do and how they had to spend more money and more money and more money. And at the time, Mr. President, the school districts realized what we all realize. Our schools in Minnesota are failing. Over half the kids can't read to grade level. Over half the kids. And we're passing mandate after mandate after mandate after mandate. Last year, the focus was on requiring schools to provide free menstrual products and put them in boys' and girls' bathrooms. Requiring schools to provide nasal anti-opioid medication. At least 2 doses at each site was the next mandate. Require school districts to report average class size to the Minnesota Department of Education. Of course, under the supervision of the state school board, Mr. President. Increase the mandates of the percentage of revenue that must be used at specific school sites. Prohibit schools from using existing levy authority to cover the cost of unemployment insurance benefits. The list goes on. Require school districts to use a political definition for anti-racist. Require learning environments meeting new state requirements. So tell them how they got to build their buildings. Require districts to identify a list of suggested and required materials. More reporting back to the state school district, Mr. President. This was only in last year's bill. School districts required to offer a course in ethnic studies. That's not helping them read, Mr. President. We're failing in reading. We're failing in math. We're failing in science. Requires what topics must be included in the curriculum. It was one of the 65 directives from the state school board to all the 332 school boards locally in the state of Minnesota. School districts required to notify parents if a recess detention is used. Districts required to report pupil withdrawal agreements. That was on page 65.30 of the nearly over 300 page bill that passed last year where the state school board directed to local school boards how they had to run their school. And I could go on and on and on with the 65 mandates, the 65 directives from this state school board that Democrats are running here, directing the local school district on how you have to run your school. Is there any guess as to why they don't have any money left after we gave them $2.2 billion, the highest increase in the history of this state? And they're out of money. Well, Mr. President, we gave them all this more to do that the state school board directed them to do. And now we got another bill before us, Mr. President. Would Senator Cwodzinski yield for a question?
Senator Cwodzinski, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Cwodzinski, do you know how many new mandates are in your bill?
Senator Cwodzinski.
Yeah, could you, would Senator Drazkowski yield for a question before I answer?
Senator Drazkowski, will you yield?
Point of order, Mr. President. I have the floor, and I asked him to yield for a question, so I asked the President to direct him so.
Senator Cwodzinski, he is correct that he has the floor. He asked you a question, so you can either say no, you don't want to answer the question, and once I recognize you later, then you can ask him a question if you like.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator. I guess my answer is going to be it depends on your definition of mandate. It's getting a little tiring hearing the word mandates from members of this body when some of these mandates in this bill came from members in your party, Senator Drazkowski, and I want to draw your attention to, like for instance, line 5.28. The commissioner must establish clear criteria for a 4-day school week. I'm guessing that that's one of the mandates you're referencing. So I don't know what to say about the word mandate when I hear that, but it does get frustrating when if you were to say a specific mandate that you're troubled with, that I could accept and understand. But when we throw out the word that there's 64 mandates in this bill, when some of them came from members of your body, your party, it just, I find it perplexing, and I don't know if I answered your question, but if I did not, please ask it again, Senator.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd be willing to offer Senator Cwodzinski another shot at it. The question would be, if he would yield, Mr. President, is Senator Cwodzinski, how many mandates are included in this bill?
Will you yield? Yes. He will yield. Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Cwodzinski, how many mandates are in your bill before us today?
Senator Cwodzinski.
I don't know. I never counted them. So I have to say I'm not aware, and that's where I would come back to if you care to meet with me later about, and maybe we can reach agreement on what is the definition of mandate so I could come up with that answer to your question.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cwodzinski. Well, there's at least a dozen. I've got a list of at least a dozen in front of me. These are mandates, directives to local school boards. As a matter of fact, Senator Cwodzinski, the example you gave us was a mandate or a directive to state government. It was not a directive to school boards. What I'm talking about is when the Democrat state school board that has evolved here in the state of Minnesota directs and requires local school districts to do certain things to run their schools, taking away their autonomy, taking away their authority from them, and centralizing it here in St. Paul. Because that's what these bills are doing. Now, this bill before us today, Mr. President, has, as I mentioned, at least a dozen more things that are required for these school boards to do on top of the 65 mandates that we gave them last year. The 65 mandates that are making them financially go under in their districts right now, we're giving them another 12 more and saying, you like those, you'll like these even more. That's what's happening here. So now schools must have a cell phone policy for student use and possession, of course, and I haven't read this provision in the bill, Mr. President, but I suspect they have to put that report together and genuflect somewhere before the Minnesota Department of Education to get their permission that it's okay. The next one on my list, schools that are converting Indian-themed mascots must report to the legislature in 25 and 26 on their progress in detail. Interestingly enough, Mr. President, this is in response to one of the failed mandates that they put in last year's bill. And these are the types of gymnastics that we're putting in front of our school boards, telling them to do with their limited amounts of time and resources. These are largely volunteer people in our communities trying to get their kids to learn how to read, for crying out loud. The third one on my list, schools must provide students with mental health curriculum and instructions to students in grades 4 through 12 beginning in 26-27 school year. Another mandate, another area that the schools are going to be forced to carve out, spend money they don't have on. The fourth one, schools must provide written notice to a coach whose contract the board is declining to renew within 60 days of the season end. Well, we are so worried that the coach is going to be offended that we're directing again to the school boards on how they must run their operations in their school districts. Schools must adopt the same grade point average weighting policy for PSEO courses as for credits earned through concurrent enrollment courses. Another dictation to local school boards on what they have to do. And Senators Lucero and others pointed out very quickly what the governor calls as book bans, where the ability to select and reconsider books in the library is essentially taken away from the school board, and it's only the librarian that can make those decisions. The next one was the one covered by Senator Nelson about school student newspapers. More dictations to the school boards throughout the state of Minnesota that are trying to get their books balanced. The school boards that we tell them they have to raise taxes because they no longer have the ability to pay for all these mandates they have, so they have to raise their property taxes. Thank you to the state school board here in St. Paul. Schools must add a language access plan that specifies the district's procedure to render effective language assistance to students and adults who communicate in a language other than English. Another mandate to local schools. Schools must consult with union representatives regarding paraprofessional training, Mr. President. So members must consult with a union representative. This bill, in a wholesale way, gives, on behalf of all the local school districts, all 332 of them, gives away their authority in this area to the labor union. This has been reserved for collective bargaining agreements in the past, Mr. President. This Democrat-controlled state school board takes this away from local school districts and tells them their union now has new power over them. Smudging must be allowed in a public school. Mr. President, would Senator Cwodzinski yield for another question?
Senator Cwodzinski will yield. He will yield. Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I suspect there's not many school districts in Minnesota that understand this new dictate from the state school board. Can you tell the members and the people of Minnesota what this new mandate, requiring the school district to allow smudging, some sort of fire must be started somewhere in the school in order to do that? Senator Cwodzinski, tell us what you know.
Yeah.
Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Jaskowski. The education team this past summer went up to a school up, where was it? Smudging, where did we visit? What school? Which Indian school? Well, we visited one of the tribal schools up north, outside Grand Rapids, as I recall, and they showed us what smudging is, and each student described how it made them feel, it gave them a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging in this big school, that they could feel like they have a sense of, as I said, purpose and belonging. And if you'd like more of a description of the philosophical and spiritual meaning behind smudging, I would defer to my colleague, Senator Kunish, who probably has a greater deal of understanding on that particular topic. But anyways, I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Senator Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Cwodzinski. So while students are failing to read in our schools, over half of them can't read, we are going to give another mandate to our schools to tell them they have to allow smudging in their schools. Now, it says here burning tobacco, sage, etc. So somewhere there's going to be a fire started in the school. I don't know. I don't know how else you burn something, but we're going to have a new room or facility. There's going to have to be supervision. Somebody's going to have to be paid. It's probably a union contract, Mr. President. Probably now the smudging supervisor is going to have to be in each school district in order to fulfill this new dictate that the state school board is forcing down the throats of our local school boards so that some students can feel good. Well, what about them reading, Mr. President? Oh, the state school board forgot that. Apparently, the state school board isn't concerned about them reading. The state school board wants to make sure that some of them have the ability to feel good while they're smudging. The next one is access to space in a building for students to receive private mental telehealth services must be provided to the extent space is available. So if there's any space available in the school, it's going to be gobbled up by this new mandate from the state school board directing our local volunteer school boards of what they have to do with the limited amount of taxpayer money that they have before them. The last one, the 12th one on my list, out of this bill, Mr. President, is an additional annual literacy screening of students K through 3. So we're increasing that mandate, that screening required from 2 times to 3 times every year that the school board locally has to do, because the state school board is so smart that they have to dictate to the local school board on how to run their schools. Well, Mr. President, members, the deficit that our schools are seeing today is only going to be exacerbated by this additional litany of mandates that this state school board, acting in arrogant fashion, is going to cram down the throats of our local school boards, who are largely volunteer people trying to look out for the kids in their community, trying to help them learn, trying to help them do math, trying to help them learn science. And they're going to be encumbered in their time with the 65 mandates from last year and the other 12 we have from this year. I think I passed the math part, Mr. President. That brings us up to 77 mandates brought forward by the state school board, forced onto our local school districts. A bad move by the state school board. Please, members, vote no for this misdirected bill that is going to go in the wrong direction, that isn't going to help our kids read, but instead is going to force all kinds of more political ideology onto the 332 school districts in the state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Gruenhagen.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, there's a few more comments I wanted to make after hearing some of the discussion, and thanks for the robust discussion. I think one of the things that contributes to our children not being able to read to grade level, which again, the statistics over 50%, that means half the students can't. And by the way, I did jail ministry for 13 years, and one of the things you quickly learn that prisoners a lot of them can't read or can't read very well at all. So it is a contributing factor to our prison population. Now, people are still responsible for their actions, but when they can't read at all, or basically read, it is a contributing factor to turn to criminal behavior. And of course, they wind up in jail. So it behooves us to teach the children to read. We have 12 years. Now that can be laid at the feet of not being able to read at whole language, inventive spelling, and creative writing, which are all based on psycholinguistic philosophy. It looks like we're starting to return to intensive systematic phonics, traditional spelling, and grammar. It's called directive education versus non-directive education, which is based in a psycholinguistic state. Second thing, when we have social promotion passes children on to the next grade level, whether or not they are competent in the basic academics of their grade level. And the result is, as you pass them on, they fall further and further behind. Second thing I'd like to quote is Senator Cwodzinski. In his initial presentation, he used two words. He used spiritual in terms of this bill, and he used self-actualization. Members, if you do your research on self-actualization, you will find it is rooted in atheistic psychology. Atheistic psychology's spiritual experience is self-actualization. Now, whether Senator Cwodzinski understands it or not, he's promoting the religion of atheism, better known as secular humanism. It is a viable religion, the belief in no God. That's not just my opinion. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled several times that atheism or secular humanism is a religion. And two legal arms of atheism is the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. They promote atheistic religious values. And you can order their so-called Bible. It's called the Secular Humanism 1, 2, and 3. And do your own research. And you will find that atheism is being promoted in our public schools, is one of feelings over truth, and it's at one of the root causes of all the problems that we're seeing in our public schools, because it's a wrong philosophy. Secondly, members, why do I say that we need to be promoting the Judeo-Christian principles our country was founded on? I want you to think about that, because they're being censored from our public schools right now, and I don't see anything in this bill to change that. The reason is, members, look at our history. Our founding fathers weren't perfect, but they laid down principles that all men were created equal, okay? And that regardless of their ethnic background. And that led to, okay, not only the Revolutionary War, but it led to the Civil War with over 620,000 casualties. And it freed the slaves at that time. It also led to giving women the right to vote. So by keeping those principles alive in our students, we will build a more perfect union. We're going down the direction of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and multiculturalism and diversity, which is based on Marxism, and it's going to produce just the opposite result. Remember one of our national mottos, it's e pluribus unum, out of many, one. We're going unum e pluribus. We're going out of one, we're creating many subdivisions, competing against each other. And that's not going to be good for the future of our children or our country. And lastly, members, I'll leave you with this. We are teaching the idea to our children, the false idea and anti-science idea, that we are different races. They cracked, do your research, they cracked the genetic code in the 90s. There's no natural selection gene. We are one race, the human race. Now, we're different ethnic groups, okay? but we're one race. That creates equality. That's what we need to be teaching to our students versus the idea of Charles Darwin that we're different races. And he, of course, was a white supremacist and a racist. And yet, that's what these bills, last session and this session, are promoting to our children. Please vote no. Vote for the principles that will build a better future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the topic of education here in the state of Minnesota. You know, there are a few different letters we typically get to sign as legislators, and I have two favorites. One of them are graduation letters, of which I'm signing a whole bunch right now, and the other are congratulatory letters when there's a baby that's been born. And it's always fitting, I think, that this time of year as we're discussing the final education bills, that many of us at our desks are signing graduation letters and or baby letters to families or students in our district. And for as political as this topic can sometimes get, Mr. President, I always try to remind myself that it's about the kids. It's about our students. And what's interesting is, if you look at education here in the state of Minnesota, there are some things, there are some metrics that we place a lot of emphasis on and that we track on a regular basis. And we do that for a reason, because we know that if we don't look at certain metrics and use those to base our decisions on, that the tendency for things to get politicized is just too tempting. And so what I'm going to do is share with members right now a couple of the metrics that the state values so importantly that it measures them annually and has been measuring them for a few different years. And I think if we truly look at the non-biased, non-partisan data regarding our students and what they are doing in our schools, it helps us guide the sort of policy that we should be passing here in the state of Minnesota. So I'll share just a few with you. Our Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment scores are down. Those are topics of reading, science, and math. Members, they've been trending downward for over a decade, and those downward trends were only compounded or magnified by the COVID pandemic and the learning experience our kids had during that period of time. Enrollment in Minnesota public schools is down. The graduation rate of our students in Minnesota public schools is down. Consistent attendance in Minnesota public schools is down. Discipline and safety issues are up, and what's also up is the number of families deciding to homeschool their children or students. Folks, that tells us everything we need to know when it comes to crafting and prioritizing our education policy here in the state of Minnesota. It's about one thing: the academic achievement and progress of our kids. It's moving in the wrong direction. It's moving in that direction quickly. And as of right now, there's no sign that it's going to change or improve in the immediate future. So everything that we do legislatively as it relates to education in K-12 schools here in Minnesota needs to be focused on that. And folks, I would submit to you that sometimes less is more. As was mentioned earlier by a member, over 70-plus mandates to public schools over the course of 2 sessions is, quite frankly, untenable. I don't know how districts are making it work, and quite frankly, many of them aren't. A second session of total control in the legislature should have worked wonders for education policy here in the state of Minnesota. We should see drastic improvements. We could have addressed the teacher pension issue as well. But what we're running into, Mr. President, is we continue to pile on to the tasks, the responsibilities of educators, administrators, school staff, and instead of allowing them the freedom and flexibility to focus on our kids in the classroom, we continue to add on additional distractions which prevent them from focusing on the sole thing they're there to do. That's to help our kids progress and achieve academically. And if we continue down that path, the metrics I shared with you earlier are going to continue in a downward trend. In education, our public schools is one of the fundamental things as a state government that we are charged with. In my opinion, it's the most important. It's what I'm most passionate about. If we can't get our statewide education policy figured out and moving in the right direction on behalf of our kids, our communities, and our state, we're failing them dramatically, and it's only going to continue to trend in the wrong direction. If I had total control of state government for one day, Mr. President, the only topic I would focus on is education. I would give our public schools the breathing room and relief they need to take care of what they need to in our school buildings and classrooms across the state. I would invite parents to be a part of the process and let them know they're valued and that we appreciate their feedback. And at the end of the day, I would ensure that the state statutes on the books provide our districts the freedom and the flexibility they deserve to manage and operate our schools the way they best see fit. And Mr. President, that's how we do best by our kids here in the state of Minnesota. They have to remain the priority. Thank you.
Any other discussion before we go to the author of the bill before voting for final passage? Seeing no other discussion, Senator Cwodzinski.
Thank you, members. I appreciate every word said today. I find it extremely edifying and delightful. And a couple quick comments. I would encourage those members that had issues with the bill and the future of education to hopefully come meet with me in January, in February, so we can maybe get some legislation that you approve of, especially when it comes to school safety. We all want and believe our kids and staff need to be safe, and there are some things we need to talk about in order to move that forward. I do have a couple of comments about things that were addressed. One of my colleagues said something to the effect that school newspapers will be able to print anything they want, but if you read the bill on whatever page it is, page 30, students will not be able to defame or use profane language or intimidate or violate federal or state law. So there are limitations on what students can print. I want to also draw attention, Senator Duckworth, if you can do all that in one day that you said you could do, that'd be a wonderful thing to behold. I also want to, Senator Gruenhagen, you had mentioned that you have found censorship of our founding documents. Maybe that censorship has come through because we don't require cursive anymore, and if there's any censorship, it's self-censorship because they haven't learned cursive in order to read those founding documents. I also want to add, well, maybe that's about it. Oh, the last thing I just want to say, we heard a lot on the floor today about kids don't know how to read. Kids don't know how to read. And the last 2 years, if there's been anything coming out of Policy Committee and Finance Committee, it's the READ Act. And we're moving forward to try to make kids not being able to read a thing of the past. And so with that said, I'd like to once again thank Senator McEwen and Senator Abler and Senator Kunish, my fellow colleagues on the conference committee. I want to thank my CA, Dana Elling, and my CLA, Chelsea Barks. I want to thank Caucus Research, Ed Cook, and Ryan Majerus. I also want to thank the Orange team, which I think they dropped the ball today. Ms. Lewis and Mr. Arneson and Ms. Hofer. And I also really, again, a major shout out to Senator Kunish, who is, her and I are an incredible team working together. And lastly, my housemate in the Minnesota House of Representatives, the co-chair, Lori Pryor, has been a true joy and a pleasure to work with, and I'm eternally grateful to her hard work and dedication to education. And with that said, members, I urge you to vote green. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary would take the roll for final passage of Senate File 3567, the Conference Committee adoption. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 35 ayes and 31 noes. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Remaining on the motions and resolutions, I am going to recognize Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the foregone recommendations and conference committee report on Senate File 4399 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee.
Senator Hoffman moves that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate File 4399 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee report. On that motion, all in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The motion prevails. He's going to explain it in one moment. The secretary will give the bill its third reading.
Senate File Number 4399, a bill for an act relating to human services, modifying and establishing laws regarding disability services, etc.
Third reading. Now, Senator Hoffman, will you tell us the differences, and then we will stand for any discussion from any members.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'll let you know the bill is coming back in the form that it left the chamber, except for a couple of things. Number one, there was a provision, and the good Senator Utke can tell you about that provision if you want. It actually became a finance provision, and so we actually had to move it from policy over to finance. And then the other thing is we held our Senate position on everything that we had, and there was agreement between the other body and here. And actually, it's a good bill, Mr. President. And with that, I just want to thank the Senate conferees, Senator Mann, Senator Utke. In the other body, you had Chair Fisher, and then Luke Frederick and Dave Baker. But also, we wanted to make sure our CA, David Zach, Cassie Soar, our CLA, Leon Monahan, the legislative analyst, Emily Spatira, who's our researcher, Bryce Hinkst, who's the other researcher. He was a big help in this. And then, of course, the pages, Mahalia Norton and Spencer Olson. And then the department, Mr. Chair, I just want to highlight the Department of Human Services has 3 absolute, fabulous, wonderful individuals that understand policy better than even Senator Abler does from Anoka. That's Christy Grom, Elise Bailey, and Matt Burdick. So with that, Mr. President, it's a great bill. Vote green. Senator Utke, please.
Any other discussion? Senator Utke.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Hoffman. I didn't catch what he first said, so I didn't know what he was setting me up to, but all I will say is it is a good bill. Vote green. It's a bill that we all saw when it left the floor originally. It went out, it got worked on, and it came back as basically as we saw it go out. One little bit maybe would be the peer specialist, peer support specialist, and we just discussed how they got paid, whether it was a 1099 or a W-2 as far as the employee went, and it ended up as a W-2, which is for that group of people is a good deal. It's a good bill, so I would just ask everybody for your support. Thank you.
The secretary will take the roll on final passage of Senate File 4399 Conference Committee report. Who's next? Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.3.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote. Oh, he'll be here. I'm sorry. We're still waiting for one more. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 7 noes, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Remaining of the motions and resolutions, Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate file number 4579 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee.
Senator Dibble moves that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee reports on Senate file 4579 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee. On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The secretary will give the bill its third reading and then we can discuss it.
Senate file number 4579, a bill for an act relating to energy, providing for and regulating shared metered utility service in residential buildings.
Third reading. Senator Dibble, if you would be so kind as to tell us the differences between when it was here and when it left only. Senator Dibble.
Great. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, just as a quick reminder, Senate File 4579 is the matter of changing our policies and practices with respect to shared meter multifamily buildings to give tenants the similar protections that we currently grant to tenants as well as homeowners and the like who are directly metered for the use of their utilities, namely electricity, water, and gas. And so with these changes, Mr. President, tenants who are in shared meter buildings would have those same protections around meter accuracy, bill fairness, disclosure, what to do to remedy if it's difficult or there's a failure to pay, those sorts of things. The bill, as we presented on the way out to conference committee, comes back, Mr. President, largely the same. A few matters were dealt with and were either changed or added into the bill to clarify and simplify the apportionment formula. When water is being billed, water would not be separately metered, so it would be apportioned on a particular formula that has to do with the number of people who live in the unit. Clarifies that late fees cannot be compounded. It adds disclosures to tenants of how bills are calculated so they know at the time at which they take possession and start renting a unit, how the bills are going to be calculated. And it clarifies a provision regarding payment agreements so that the interests and the concerns of landlords and tenants are balanced. And Mr. President, I would like to thank, of course, my co-authors, Senators Pappas, Mitchell, Umover, Baton, and Westland, and of course my co-members of the conference committee, Senators Weber and Port. And would like to thank Ben Stanley, who did a tremendous amount of work on this bill, as well as Primo, who also did a lot of work and worked very hard on this, as well as Legal Aid and the Multi-Housing Association, both of whom agree, and this is a mutually supported bill by those parties. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on Senate File 4579, the conference committee report? Seeing none, the secretary will take the roll on final passage of Senate File 4579. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 49 ayes and 18 noes. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Remaining under motions and resolutions, Senator McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate file number 3852 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed and amended by the
Senator McEwen
as amended by the conference committee. Thank you.
Senator McEwen moves that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate file 3852 be now adopted and the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee. Senator McEwen, will you kindly tell us what are the differences between when the bill left and it coming back? Senator McEwen.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Again, it's my honor to present the conference committee report for the labor policy bill, Senate file 3852. I am pleased to report to the body that the conference committee report before you is largely unchanged from the form that passed off the Senate floor. There is one provision that we adopted from the House language to ban the use of restrictive covenants in some service contracts known as shadow non-compete agreements, along with an amendment to exclude workers in the tech industry from this provision. We also adopted an effective date amendment to reflect the Department of Labor and Industry's intent on a provision that they brought forward. I'd like to thank our Senate conferees, Senator Hauschild, Senator Umer Verbaten, as well as our House counterparts, Representative Nelson, Berg, and Myers, for the work to reconcile our two bills to bring this conference committee report before you today. Members, I once again ask for your support, and I will stand for questions. Thank you.
Any questions on the motion before the body before I go to third reading? Senator Dornick, would you like to ask the questions now, or would you like for me to go to third reading? It's up to you. It's okay for me to go to third reading? And then I'll recognize you first, okay? The secretary will give the bill its third reading.
Oh, you got to vote on the adoption.
Oh. Sorry, we have to vote on the adoption first. All in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. The motion prevails. The secretary will give the bill its third reading, and then I'll go to Senator Dornick.
Senate file number 3852, a bill for an act relating to labor, making policy and technical changes to programs and provisions under the Department of Labor and Industry.
Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was wondering if Senator McEwen would yield for a question.
Senator McEwen, will you yield for a question? She will yield for a question. Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator McEwen. So the question is the provision that was accepted. Can you tell us? You kind of told us what it was. Did we hear that on the Senate floor?
Senator McEwen, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dornick, I do not believe that we heard that on the Senate floor, no.
Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator McEwen would yield for one more question.
Will you yield for another question, Senator McEwen? She will yield for another question. Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator McEwen. So if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but this was in judiciary, the bill, and that never made it out of judiciary, so this got put in conference committee without going through judiciary. Is that correct?
Senator McEwen, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Dornick, for the question. Senator Dornick, we did work with the chair of Judiciary around the language in the bill to make sure that it was appropriate for us to add it to go ahead and take the House language.
Senator Dornick, to the well, you have the floor, Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator McEwen. That's one thing that's puzzled me and also frustrated me too, is some of the processes that going around and adding things, not only just in the conference committee, but as I was in the committee, especially the last day, things that were added. But I appreciate the time, the opportunity to talk about labor and industry, because labor is so important. And I just think of the careers of so many people that study, go to school, go to the trades, and the skills and the training they get to get into the market to provide finances to support their families or themselves, and just how important labor and industry is. And I've always said that we are to be the and unfortunately, what I see sometimes is it's labor versus industry, and I don't like that. So just the delicate relationship that we need to be as government, not to get in the way of that relationship with labor and industry. And I had mentioned before just the amount of time and the sweat and tears and the money and the risk to start a business. And the American dream is to start a business. And government has kind of made that sometimes a bad dream. People have to put their life savings sometimes to get into a business. And the first year, actually, if I remember right, and I think I quoted this last time, in year 2 to 5, 70% of businesses fail. So it's not like it's an easy thing. And so with the making the business, government doesn't create business. It makes policies to help encourage business. And unfortunately, some of the mandates that we've continued to pass over the last few years have made it so businesses are getting discouraged. I just think of the one, I've talked to many, but I'll just give one example of a small business owner that just had one employee. Him and his wife have spent years getting their business together, and as last year he was frustrated with me, and he said, well, we looked at our finances and our business, and we decided to let that employee go because they work so many hours, and yet they're still trying to make ends meet. And that's not what we want to do. And I mentioned before, too, that 62% approximately of business owners have 4 employees or less. 4 employees or less, 62% of small businesses, which is 500,000 conservatively. That's more than that. So we're talking about a lot of people, both in small businesses and those that are working, the labor, the employee. And we're getting in the middle of those relationships. And then if I go up just a little higher, it's 86% of businesses have 20 or less employees. And we hear and continue to hear about big business and corporations and the business or the labor that they hurt, but yet most of these businesses are small and have relationships with their employees. And many times they carve out things and do things because the most valuable part of their business is that relationship and that labor. And I had an opportunity to both work in the business world as a union carpenter for 22 years. The friendships and the work that we accomplish and that self of accomplishment and pride that we see and the things that we built, the things we work together. And I just talked to one of my coworkers over the weekend that I used to work with for 10 years. And just the instant relationship or that we had just talking together, and he was glad I called, and just how important working together labor is and those relationships we build. And yet with the business world, we do the same thing. Labor, industry, employee, employer, and that relationships. And I feel like government sometimes gets in the way of that. And I think some of the issues that one thing that we don't talk about that sometimes is a bigger factor of hurting labor is inflation. Think about groceries that have gone up 30% in the last 4 years. Inflation, 7 to 8%. Interest rates have doubled. Mandates, regulations, inflation, like I said, taxes, government spending, all of these affect labor and industry. Instead of always pointing the finger to the business owners and those that risk much to start a business, maybe we should start to watch our own house. The things that we do that affect business, labor, and those policies, and start listening to those that are trying to help us, guide us through some of the issues that they're hard. There's some things that we do that it's, hard decisions. And what I've always said is I've tried to be that and. I don't pick a side. We are to bring together labor and industry. The cost of doing business continues to go up. And what businesses do, they adjust to that. One, they don't even start a business. They don't want to take the risk. Two, they don't expand. And three, that I mentioned, the business owner cut back, or we automate. Some businesses move to states that are more friendly to business. So this bill has some good provisions in it, and I appreciate those. Thank you, Senator McEwen, for those and the committee. But there are some things here that are more mandates that just make it harder for businesses to do business and make it more expensive. So with that, I encourage a no vote, and I just want to thank you for the time and for the work again for all the committee members that I had opportunity to work with. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Grudenhagen, we are on 3852. That's the bill we're on. Senator Grudenhagen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I was on the Labor Committee and appreciated the Senator McEwen, who was the chair, allowing a robust discussion. We didn't agree very often, but at least we had a good, robust discussion. Also appreciated Senator Dornick as the lead. I'll just pick out one area I'd like to talk about, and that's included in this bill, and it's Senate File 3947. And it basically applies minimum wage to small employers, not just large. And it removes the distinction between large and small employers for hotels, resorts, and summer work exchange employees, and minors or large employers. It also puts an inflation guard or inflation minimum wage or estimate onto minimum wage. It'll go up to 5% per year. It was capped at 2.5%. Now it's going to 5%. Members, we had minorities come to the Labor Committee, and they complained that they can't afford educational things for their children, food, rent, ad nauseum. And I understand that. With the inflation from the Biden administration, the printing up of money by the Federal Reserve, it's putting a crunch, especially on our low middle class and poor in this state. I also had a discussion with a customer of mine. He owns a small business, extremely successful. Him and his 3 sons and a couple in-laws run the business. It's generated a huge amount of revenue. And he just told me on Friday we met that they're leaving the state of Minnesota because of the mandates that were passed last session. They're not staying here anymore, okay? So there goes another small business. They've been here all their life. They like Minnesota. Talked to another friend of mine a couple weeks ago. He has 21 employees. He runs a small tech firm. He is cutting 2 of his employees to deal with the higher expense and mandates of what we passed in the Labor Committee. So members, here what I want you to understand. Number 1, 3M, Medtronic, Apple, Microsoft, they all started as small businesses. And unfortunately, we're crushing small business in the state of Minnesota. And that, that's what this bill takes us further down the road to do. Second thing, members, when you grow government, which is an expense on the private sector, exponentially, and last session we grew government by over 40%, raised taxes another $9 to $10 billion. Well, did the private sector that sends the tax revenue in grow at 40%? Did the incomes in the private sector grow at 40%? No. So government is hurting the private sector when it grows at a 40% or more rate and then passes all types of mandates on. So when we had these low-income people come to the Labor Committee and complain that they couldn't afford rent, they couldn't afford their food, they couldn't afford to pay for education, for some of their education for their children, gas, etc., we can look no further than the government making it miserable. And of course, then what do they want? They want a raise in the minimum wage. So I told them, talk to your Democratic friends. Tell them to stop growing government faster than the private sector and population. Because I said, you know what? We could pass this minimum wage, but it's not going to help, because when the cost of government shows up in the private economy, everything's going to go up exponentially. So I said, you're going to be right back here in a year or two saying, we can't afford rent, we can't afford groceries, we can't afford educational things for our children. Government has to be restrained. Of course, the founding principles of our country was limited government. We've way overgone that, and this bill takes us even further down the road of growing government exponentially. So members, some of you maybe need to take an economics course, okay? Economics 101. You cannot continue to grow government through mandates, regulations, and the size of government faster than the private sector. You have to bring it into balance. And yet this bill and our Labor Committee takes us further and further down the road of damaging the private sector. Again, all these big businesses, which we're blessed to have in Minnesota, and I won't name them all, but they started as a small business. We need to create a fertile economic and tax structure for small businesses. Instead, we're erasing that. And we're saying, sorry, we don't want you to start a small business in the state of Minnesota. Why don't you just move out? And of course, some of my customers in my insurance agency are doing just that. Vote no on this bill if you care about small businesses, small and mid-sized businesses, and the private sector. We need to stop growing government at a rate that cannot be sustained. Thank you, Mr. President.
Members, before we go to the bill author for final words, anyone else? Seeing none, Senator McEwen, before we vote.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, members, for both the robust discussion in the Labor Committee as we moved on all of these bills forward through the session. I'm very proud of the work that we all did together, and also very thankful to the many Minnesotans, workers and business owners alike, who testified on the bills that came before us. I would just note that there's a lot of talk that we just heard about what we can afford and what we can't afford. And I want to make sure that it's clear to the people of Minnesota that the halls of the Capitol are swarming with paid lobbyists working for the interests of industry and business in our state and nationally. Sometimes they fly them in to come and have meetings and talk with elected officials. So putting a bill through that protects workers, you will hear rhetoric around that. You'll hear a lot of rhetoric about mandates. When you hear that rhetoric about mandates, realize that what they're talking about are things like paid family medical leave. What they're talking about are things like earned sick and safe time, so when your kid is sick, you can actually take the time that you need to take care of them and to take care of yourself. Those are the mandates that you will hear bandied about. You're talking about basic human and workers' rights. So I wholeheartedly reject the premise that businesses in Minnesota, small businesses, large businesses alike, don't respect the human rights of their workers and aren't prepared to lift the basic floor of what we're talking about when we're talking about a dignity, qualified, like quality of life for the people of this state. Our businesses in Minnesota are prepared to have a good quality of life for the people that are working at their businesses. So I reject the premise that they can't do that. And by and large, we have heard from the business community in our state that they are wanting these things. They don't want to have to compete with businesses that are in a race to the bottom. What we can't afford, members, is the billionaire class in this country. So respectfully, I ask for your support of this labor policy omnibus bill, and I look forward to the work that we will continue to do together. Thank you.
The Secretary will take the roll on final passage of the committee report for Senate File 3852. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 34 ayes and 33 noes, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members remaining on the motions or resolutions will revert to the third order of business. Messages from the House. The secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has adopted the recommendation and report of the Conference Committee on House File Number 4124 and repassed said bill in accordance with the report of the committee, so adopted. House File Number 4124, a bill for an act relating to state government appropriating money from the Outdoor Heritage Fund, Clean Water Fund, Parks and Trails Fund, and Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. House File Number 4124 is herewith transmitted to the Senate. Signed, Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Hurd, for your motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee reports on House File 4124 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee.
Senator Hurd moved that the foregoing recommendation and conference committee report on House File 4124 be now adopted and the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee. Senator Hurd, will you please tell us exactly what's the differences between when the bill went off the floor and it's coming back from conference committee? Senator Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank our conference member, especially our Senate member, Senator Housley and Senator Pa, and also our counterpart in the House, Chair Leon Lilly, Representative Liz Lee, and also Representative Becker. The difference is that we have made a number of small provision add on to the bill, so I could quote unquote gotcha bill. So we just take a little time to remove three provision in regard to that, and we want to make sure as a conversation transpire in committee. Chair Lilly has also promised Representative Becker on making sure that grant doesn't go into the wrong applicants, and that we also continue to honor our men and women in service, whether that's in law enforcement or in the military. That's the gist of it, Mr. President. I can go on, talk a little bit about the bill if you allow me.
Yes, you could just talk about those differences between when it went off the floor and when it has now come back. So if you would relegate your comments to that, that'd be helpful. Mm-hmm. Senator Hurd.
Yes, and the House File 4124 is a Legacy Amendment Conference Committee report coming back with consensus. The bill itself is worthy of our celebration as it carries policy to address some long-awaited projects and event commemoration. All provision this bill is worthy of their own accolades. However, I want to give a shout out to a few items under each articles, like on Article Arts and Cultural Heritage.
Senator Hurd?
Yes.
Are these the differences in the provision from when it left and when it came back? We wanted to make sure that you're talking about that.
Yes, Mr. President, the differences, I already explained the differences that there's a few provision that was a little outreach for some members, and we cleaned those out, and so the language is clean and is good to go.
All right. Any other discussion on this bill before I go to third reading? Any other discussion? Any other discussion before I adopt the committee report, and then we'll go to third reading?
Mr. President.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just want to commend the conference committee for keeping in the amendment for the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam conflict. I think it's important that we have a statewide commemoration for that. It was in the Senate bill, it wasn't in the House bill, and I just want to, I just appreciate that our conferees defended that position.
Senator Hurd moves that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on House File 4124 be now adopted and the bill be repassed as amended by conference committee. All in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The secretary will give the conference committee report adoption its third reading.
House File Number 4124, a bill for an act relating to state government appropriating money from the Outdoor Heritage Fund, etc.
Third reading. Any other discussions Senator Green.
Well, Mr. President, I just want to, I know that we debated this bill for a long time, and that was good that we did that, because generally we don't get that on this bill. It's a little disappointing, I think, that the conference committee only met for 20 minutes to discuss some of the changes, and 3 of the Senate provisions that we had put in that were voted on to be put into this bill were stripped out with apparently not very much discussion, and one of them was to prevent funds being used to promote violence against our EMTs, firefighters, and police. The other was the funds that should not be used to promote Hamas or terrorism, and the other was for convicted felons. And so, but the one thing that I didn't mention on the bill, and I hope that people will take the time now to read these bills, because it's an important thing. You got $750 million every 2 years, and it's some serious money that goes here, and with very little oversight. And it looks like the biggest oversight was at our debate on the Senate floor. And like I said, I appreciate the debate, but we need more of that before this bill comes forward. And one thing I do want to mention too, besides some of the other stuff that was in there, you know, we had $30 million to NGOs, just Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited, that we still don't really know where that money is going to go to. And also, I just want to point out, University of Minnesota in this bill gets $25 million, and they didn't even show up in committee for any testimony to answer questions. And so we do have a long way to go. I still don't support the bill in its fashion. It still spends more money and buys more land by double than any other bill that I've seen come through here in the years that I've been in office. So I can't support the bill. I hope people will not support this. We still need a lot more work to do in this area of the legacy amendment. So thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussions before we go to the bill author for final brief comments before we vote? Seeing none, Senator Herr.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments, and I also look forward to bipartisan support and get this bill passed and to the governor's desk. I just want to shout out to a few items that deserve a little cheering, especially under the arts and culture heritage. We have the Twin City Jazz Festival, the Caprice Theater, the 250 years anniversary of that Declaration of Independence, and the 50-year celebration of Southeast Asian in Minnesota, as Senator Pratt just mentioned, and the Hawj Dome Croatia Hall, and the Julian Garland Ruby Slippers. A shout out go under to the park and trail articles. We uphold 40-40-20 agreement for state parks, Greater Minnesota Park, and Metro Regional Parks. And more cheer go to the clean water articles as we garner policy on chloride reduction and reducing nitrate contamination in the southeast the part of our state. And under the outdoor heritage article, the council recommendation added appropriation to the construction of invasive carp deterrent, BAF for short, but it's by acoustic fish fence on the Mississippi River at Lock and Dam number 5. Securing funding to this long-awaited project deserve a high applaud, and I thank you, the LaSalle Sam Outdoor Heritage Council, for insert this in and recommend this in for us to vote it into the bill at the very last part of the bill itself. As mentioned before, this bill, the Legacy Amendment Bill's mission is to protect, restore, and enhance our environment and preserve our arts and cultural heritage. This year's policy fit well under this mission. It's a good and beautiful bill, members, and I ask for your support. I want to again thank our conferee members, Senator Housley and Senator Pa, and also our House counterpart, Representative Lee, Representative Leon Lee, Representative Becker, and I also want to take this time to thank our staff here and committee members in the Environment Committee, Senator McEwen, my vice chair, and also lead member, Senator Eichhorn, Senator Green, Senator Lane, Senator Wiesenberg, Senator Houschild, Senator Hoffman, and Senator Kunish. Our committee staff, Mr. Dan Mueller, fiscal analyst, Ben Stanley, Senate counsel, and Carla Josephson, committee administrator, Michael Vu, committee legislative assistant, Cassie Tomadov, DFL researcher, and Greg Axley, GOP researcher, Victor Florell, legislative assistant for Senator Eichhorn, and Alice Kent, drafting support specialist, and one more time to our pages, CJ, Olivia, and Princess. And I ask for your support. Thank you, members.
The Secretary would take the roll on final passage of the House file as amended by the Conference Committee. Senator Bowden, for those voting pursuant to Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye.
And Senator Port votes aye. Oh, we do? 4124. Okay, got it. Okay. Members, thanks for your patience. We're waiting for one person. All members having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 43 ayes and 24 noes, the bill House File 4224 is passed and its title agreed to 4124. I think I said House File 41. House File 4124 is passed and its title agreed to as amended by the conference committee. Members, I'm calling on Senator Murphy for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move a brief recess for the purpose of appointing conference committees.
To that motion, all in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Senate is now in recess. The Senate will come to order. Senator Murphy.
Mr. President, is there a privileged report at the desk?
Yes, there is. The secretary will read the report.
Senator Murphy from the Subcommittee on Conference Committees recommends that the following senators be, and they hereby are, appointed as a conference committee on Senate File number 4942, Senators Frentz, Klein, Putnam, Zhang, and Dames. And Senate File number 4699, Senators Wickland, Mann, and Kupek. Senator Murphy moves that the foregoing appointments be approved.
To that motion, all in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The motion prevails. Members, we will now proceed to the 13th order of business, announcements of Senate interest. Senator Rarick.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I would ask you to join me in recognizing a group that has gone through a lot of struggles in Minnesota. Those of you who were here a couple years ago know we had the issue with the men's gymnastics team at the University of Minnesota being canceled. But they have continued, and they're part of a group that competes outside of the collegiate level. And yesterday, down in Daytona Beach, at the Gym Act National Championships, that our Minnesota team won the national championship. We had two individuals who won in their respective competitions, Kellen Ryan on vault and Charlie Larson on floor exercise. And Coach Mike Burns was named Coach of the Year. So I hope everyone will join me in congratulating them when you get an opportunity and continuing to advocate for them. They're struggling, but they're doing wonderful, and we need to continue to support them and the great work that they do. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Young.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, tomorrow is May 14, Hmong SGU Veterans Remembrance Day. There will be an event at the Capitol Mall tomorrow at 9:30 at the Hmong SGU Memorial at the front of the Capitol. The SGUs will be there, students will be there, several members from the Hmong community will be there, and I just sent out an email reminder, and so please tomorrow, you're all welcome. Please take the time to join us, and hope to see you there. Thank you.
Without objection, the following senators will be excused from today's session. Draheim from 1 o'clock to 1:40 p.m. and Cwodzinski from 2:45 to 3:10 p.m. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senate GOP, a reminder that after adjournment, we'll be caucusing upstairs at 3:23. Thank you.
Members, I also just want to call to your attention before we go to Senator Murphy for a motion that we have a couple University of Minnesota graduates with us today who graduated, who've been serving as our pages. Princess Gut Tao. I think she's still down there. Stand up so we can at least see you. And the other person that's not here is Alexis Varner, who is my committee legislative assistant. So we want to congratulate them for graduating yesterday. I went to the graduation, and I was really happy for our young people. So I know we're not supposed to applaud, but we can give them a hand. So Senator Murphy for a motion.
Mr. President, I move the Senate do now adjourn until Wednesday, May 15th at 11 a.m.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Senate is now adjourned until Wednesday.